Thanks for staying with us. My name is Lillian Muli. She has 18 years experience working as a high-profile journalist and media specialist. She's worked as an award-winning TV correspondent, host, and bureau chief for Al Jazeera English headquarters in Doha, Qatar. She was responsible for the launch of the TV network in West Africa, in Nigeria, where she worked for 7 years and helped establish and lead the network's East Africa operation from Nairobi and across East Africa. Prior to working for Al Jazeera, Yvonne worked as a correspondent for the BBC in London, United Kingdom. Last year, she was appointed UN Refugee Agency spokesperson for Kenya. Yvonne Ndege is my guest in studio tonight. Good evening.
Lillian, good evening to you.
That is quite an impressive CV, Yvonne.
Well,
congratulations.
Thank you.
Let's begin with the fact that you've worked in over 30 countries on the continent. You've covered war, you've covered natural disasters, you've covered elections. When was your first big break?
Ooh, good question. My first big break was definitely at the BBC in the United Kingdom, where I lived and worked and grew up, and I was a BBC graduate trainee, and that was really my beginning in journalism. And it was an incredible experience because to work for such a renowned and such a credible media institution was amazing. I was exposed to professional standards, journalistic quality and rigor that I had never experienced or never imagined. So I sort of have to say that the making of me was definitely at the BBC in the UK.
Mm-hmm. Let's just go back to a little bit on your background. How to break through, because a lot of journalists obviously want to work for a lot of these international media houses. Let's go back to growing up and how you actually ended up in London.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, you're right. What you say is right. Well, my parents were born and raised in Kenya. I'm Kenyan, and journalism is what took them to the UK, because my father worked as a journalist in Kenya and got the opportunity to travel to the UK to work within the media. And so from a very young age, obviously I saw him working as a journalist, I saw him as a broadcaster, and he mainly covered African news from Europe, and it was incredibly inspirational to see him. So from a very young age, I would say from about 12 or 13, I actually knew that I wanted to be a journalist. Not only a journalist, a news journalist, very specifically, and a correspondent. So those were the beginnings. And the question for me was how, okay? So I worked very hard to look for opportunities to sort of break into the media. My first sort of break, believe it or not, actually happened in well, I can't tell you the exact year because I'll be telling you how old I am. Let's just say in the 90s.
Yeah, and women don't do that.
Yes, it was in the 90s, in the early 90s.
Yeah.
In the UK, you have work placement, okay, in high school, and I'm sure there are opportunities like that here in Kenya. So in the UK, my work school placement was actually at the BBC. So at age 14, I had 4 weeks at the BBC. So that was my real first professional introduction to journalism. I was only opening letters and getting tea for journalists and stuff like that. But it was still an amazing experience because it exposed me to our world, the issues, politics, development, issues in society, because I was actually, what they had me doing was sort of reading letters from around the world on the BBC World Service. So that's basically where it all started. Yeah.
Right. 18 years experience, Yvonne, working as a high-profile journalist. Did you always want to be a foreign correspondent? I've seen you reporting from just about every part of the world. Was this what you specifically wanted to do? Were you assigned to do this?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, obviously, working at the BBC in England was incredible. Okay, it was amazing. But after a few years of covering Europe, the UK, the US, the Western countries of this world, something within me was drawn to Kenya specifically, my country of origin, my homeland, the land that my parents left when they were very young, and Africa. I was very interested in understanding why the world is the way it is and why Africa is the way it is. So the opportunity arose for me to come to Africa when I was approached by Al Jazeera and poached by Al Jazeera to leave the BBC and join them. And they sort of said to me, look, you know, we want you to become a correspondent, you know, in this country in East Africa called Kenya, you know, in this city called Nairobi. Have you heard about it? And of course, for me, it was like music to my ears, because I was like, my God, I can't believe people are actually going to pay me to go to Kenya, you know, and just sort of discover my roots and my heritage and the issues where I come from, and to travel the whole continent. Yes.
This is to say you came to Kenya with zero knowledge of Swahili. Had you been here previously? Had you actually come to Kenya before? Was this your first interaction with the Kenyan people and with Kenya?
Good question, Lillian. Good question. When we were growing up, we didn't come to Kenya often. I think I first came to Kenya when I was maybe around, I was a teenager. I would say I was a teenager, if I remember correctly. It's a long time ago now. So I hadn't had a lot of interaction with Kenya, but at home in England, my parents did speak Swahili to each other. So I had some knowledge of it, but not obviously enough to speak it. And then when I started my professional career here, of course, I didn't have knowledge of the language. I didn't know a great deal about my roots and my heritage. I just sort of knew, okay, we're from Kenya, and now I get to work here.
Let's go back to, like I said, you've done war reporting, and you're that calm face even in the midst of war. What's it like covering a war?
Whew, good question. My first kind of experience actually of unrest, okay, serious unrest, was here in my homeland, Kenya, in 2007, because that's when I actually started working for Al Jazeera. So I was deployed here for the elections in 2007, and we all know what happened. And that was the first time I saw serious violence taking place. I saw people dying, because you don't see that kind of thing covering, you know, politics in London or in other European cities. So that was my first sort of experience, and that was the first time I kind of thought, my God, people's lives are in danger. My life could actually be in danger just by mere virtue of the fact that I have to go out there into the streets to report what's going on, you know, for the news. So that was sort of my first real foray, so to speak, into war reporting, conflict reporting, unrest. Then things got worse for me, because I then ended up going to Congo for significant periods of time. At that time, it was probably around 2009, that kind of 2008, 2009, that kind of period where you had a lot of militia groups operating in eastern DRC, and I was deployed to cover the conflict there. And that was the first time I would say I felt in real danger. I felt that my life could be in danger. I remember at some stage a colleague of mine, myself and a colleague of mine from Al Jazeera, we were apprehended by a militia group, you could say, and imprisoned for several days in deepest, darkest Congo. I mean, we didn't really know where we were. We didn't have any communications. We didn't have any mobile phones. And I think that was the first time I thought, my God, I could actually disappear here.
And you kept going, although as journalists we're told no story is worth your life. No story is worth risking your life. What kept you going?
Passion, and not realizing that it's actually a job that you're doing. I mean, that's the honest truth. I think when I look back at the experiences I've had in dangerous situations, in conflict zones, from the situation in Kenya in 2007 to the Democratic Republic of Congo to Somalia to Nigeria, you forget when you're in the field that actually you're in harm's way, or you could be in harm's way, or you could be the victim of violence, because you're so focused on delivering. I know you know what I'm talking about.
Yes,
the news, the stories.
Although pundits feel, Yvonne, that the negative narrative sells better in Africa for international media. There's a lot of critics who feel and who have actually criticized international media as being extremely negative about the African story, be it our politics, be it our poverty, that it is extremely exaggerated. Is that an unfair argument? Does that hold any truth whatsoever, in your opinion?
It's completely fair. It's actually completely fair. I think the problem, I mean, there are many problems, there are many challenges, and we could talk for hours, and I know we don't have hours to talk. On the one hand, a lot of correspondents and reporters don't have as much control as the audiences think. Okay, so you have editors, you have bosses sitting in places like London, like Doha, like New York, like Washington DC, actually telling you what the stories ought to be, or the stories that they think are interesting for their audiences, or the stories that they will choose to deploy a team on. Okay, so as a woman of Africa and a woman of African heritage, naturally you would want to sort of convey and show the good side, the positive side, the stories of the continent of prosperity. But you know, on some occasions, more often than not, sadly, stories are rejected. There's also the issue, as you know, that good news doesn't sell. Audiences are not interested in good news. Audiences are not interested in the cat that got rescued from up the tree. They want the blood and guts. If it bleeds, it leads. You've heard the phrase. So no, I don't think what you're saying is unfair. I think that yes, the stories have tended to be negative. But having said that, when I think about experiences at the BBC, at Al Jazeera, you often find that in these situations, we can take the post-election violence in Kenya in 2007, the situation in DRC, the conflict with Boko Haram in Nigeria. The voice of the voiceless is what the media is supposed to be. And oftentimes, the people who say, well, everything's great in Africa, everything's fine, everything's progressing, are people who are resourced, are people who are wealthy, are people who are in government. They're very rarely the underdogs. So in a way, I think sometimes, the international media want to be champions of these voiceless people. And sometimes what ends up happening is you get an imbalance. So you get more of the sort of negative stories than you do the positive ones.
Talking about the work culture in the international community, for those who have ambitions, perhaps journalists, to scale those heights, what are some of the must-dos? And for you as Yvonne, an African young upcoming journalist, what is it that you had to do to break through that glass ceiling, to get your voice heard, to actually get promoted, to get to opportunities where you're actually coming to Africa to set up shop?
I would say, Lillian, education. I'd actually say it 3 times. I was incredibly privileged. I realized that as an adult, to be educated in England, to have the opportunity to go to respected and established educational institutions, to get my undergraduate degree from London School of Economics, my master's degree from London School of Economics. So I would say education is absolutely the first thing. And it's true what they say, as a black woman, you've got to work 10 times harder than everybody else. You've got to be 10 times smarter than everybody else. So having to be, well, I wouldn't say I'm smart, but having to work pretty hard is a key thing. Right. I would also say that another key thing for me in terms of breaking the ceiling is self-belief and determination. I truly believe in the power of self-belief. I remember when I first got into the BBC, I was the only black girl in a certain program, working on a certain program as a producer. I remember very vividly. And I remember very distinctly people questioning me, questioning my ability, because I was the only black woman working on that show, and wondering whether I was actually qualified to be there, whether I was educated enough to be there, or whether I was just a token, whether they were just filling a affirmative action quota, and people doubting my ability. And I think what kept me going was, like I said, that determination and that self-belief to succeed. But absolutely, there's no question, I think as a woman, and definitely as a woman of colour, in these environments which are so male dominated, first of all, and of course in Europe and in the UK, European dominated, I had to work 2 or 3 times harder, I would say. Right. And resilience, tenacity, self-belief, determination, acquiring skills, training, constantly learning, constantly believing that you can achieve something, having a dream, having a passion. And for me, I never doubted that it would be possible for me to be a foreign correspondent, to be deployed to my country of origin, my homeland, Kenya, and to be able to stand in front of cameras and talk about not just the post-election violence, but all sorts of things happening across this country.
West Africa, Nigeria in particular, and let's talk about the fact that you're a mom. So you're actually, you know, in it, you're working, and you find out you're expectant, and yet here you are working in this extremely challenging environment, and you know, this job is pretty much a 24/7. You could be on call at any time. How did you receive news that you were expectant, and indeed just going to motherhood and now having to balance work and raising Safari, your daughter? Share with us a little bit about how that went for you.
Well, when I came to the realization that I was going to become a mom, it was very daunting, extremely daunting. I was doing incredibly well at Al Jazeera. I was a household name in Nigeria, Africa's most popular station, and West Africa. I was on the fast track, so to speak, professionally. And the minute I realized I was going to become a mother, I panicked. I thought, oh my God, what's going to happen to my career? Will they get rid of me? Will I be able to cope with the demands of news journalism, which basically are anytime a pin drops in West Africa, you have to go there, whether it's Bamako, whether it's Dakar, whether it's N'Djamena, whether it's any part of the West Africa region. I would have to be there in an instant, and it really was a very uncertain time for me. And you know, when I did eventually give birth to my daughter Safari, which was an incredible experience, I have to say. Becoming a mother, I think, is the greatest thing that can ever happen to a woman. That's my personal view. I know not everybody agrees with that. I loved it, but I realized that I actually had to sort of reassess my life. I realized that I was putting myself in harm's way more often than I wanted to. At that time I was in Nigeria, and I don't know how much audiences know about Nigeria, you know, but we had, and we continue to have in Nigeria, an Islamic uprising. So a lot of the stories revolved around suicide attacks, bombings, extremely dangerous situations. And I kind of thought to myself, well, you know, I don't know if I really want to tell these stories. Like, I care about Africans, I care about Nigerians, I care about everybody, but do I actually want to risk my life going to tell these stories when I have a child at home, when I have a baby at home? What if something happened to me? And that's, I think, when I really started to sort of reassess things. So it's extremely challenging, I think, for women and for mothers, and there is no question that's why you see women falling out of the media business and leaving the media industry, because it really is 24/7. Yeah, not that my current work is easy, but it really is 24/7. The expectation, as I know you know, with TV, 24 hours, social media, you are expected to deliver 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it's just very difficult if you also want to give your child the kind of commitment that I wanted to give Safari, my daughter.
And your transition to the UNHCR, congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
So having worked as a journalist, your transition to being the spokesperson now in this agency, the fact that you are now on the opposite side of the pendulum, and yet you've been on the ground, you've seen and experienced the suffering that's out there, now having to be a spokesperson that actually portrays, or I mean, for lack of a better word, that has to sometimes incorporate a little bit of PR into what it is that you're saying. The challenge that lies there, or the advantage that lies in your background, having worked as a journalist. Let's talk about your new undertaking as the UNHCR spokesperson here in Kenya.
Well, it was an interesting transition for me, because for a while I'd been feeling as if I'd sort of done it all as a news media journalist, particularly in West Africa. There isn't a place in West Africa that I hadn't been to 10 times, you know. And I kind of thought, okay, I need a new challenge, I need to up my game. I need to be in a position where I can truly change things. Don't get me wrong, Lillian, I'm not saying that as journalists we don't change things, but I wanted to have greater impact. So UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, came to me at the right time, because I was already sort of thinking to myself, okay, how can I have more leverage? How can I have more power? And it has been an incredible transition so far, for good reasons. In this country, we have 500,000 refugees in Kakuma and in Dadaab, mainly from Somalia and from South Sudan. And prior to me coming to Kenya, I was known, you could say, as the refugee correspondent. I was known as the lady you always see at some refugee camp in Congo or in Nigeria or in, you know, some other part of Africa. So I was sort of very interested in issues of refugees, displaced people, stateless people, people who have been uprooted. It was my thing. It was my interest. And like I said, it's been an amazing transition and journey. In my current role, my job is to really represent these communities, this community. In the specific case of Kenya, like I said, we're talking about 500,000 refugees in our country. My role is to really convey to you, the media, ordinary men and women, the experience of these people, the fact that they have been uprooted from their homes, and the fact that they need not only our support, but they need to be empowered, they need to be equipped, they need to be educated, they need to be given all the resources and privileges that we enjoy.
And let's talk about the African migrants crisis in Libya. CNN published a report that brought this situation to global attention. Where's the UN's voice in all of this? And indeed, how is the UN handling this particular crisis?
Well, good question. The UN Refugee Agency was shocked and appalled by the story emerging from Libya around African refugees, which we saw on the news media, as you mentioned. We do have a presence, thankfully, thank God, in Libya, but not to the extent that we would want to have. We know that there are around 17,000 or so refugees and migrants in detention in Libya, and UNHCR genuinely, Lillian, works incredibly hard to provide those refugees with the basic needs that they have. Number one, protection. Okay, that's the key mandate of our organization. That's what we're here to do. And we have, in recent times, been able to evacuate some of the refugees that have been caught up in the stuff that we've been seeing on the news media. One of the problems is that when there is the sort of conflict that I described, in places like Nigeria and other parts of West Africa and the African continent, people flee. They don't know what they're getting into, obviously. And then they find that they are subjected to exploitation, to sexual and gender-based violence, to trafficking. And unfortunately, if what we understand that has been reported is accurate, even slavery. So, you know, like I said, we are appalled. We are scaling up operations there to try and support the refugees who are there. We have recently carried out successfully some evacuations, and I can tell you in the last few hours, I mean literally in the last 2-3 days, the Libyan authorities, as you know, one of the challenges is that there's an unstable government in Libya. They have agreed to allow us to kind of operate a transit type center to get people out who are affected by this.
Let's come closer home as we wind up the Dadaab voluntary repatriation. How far are we on that? Are we still on course in terms of closure?
Okay, well, voluntary repatriation is ongoing. At least 70,000, around 70,000 people have been repatriated to Somalia, and we have two types of situations evolving. You have the formal voluntary repatriation, where people come to us, to UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, and say, look, I want to go back to Somalia. I want to face whatever I'm going to face there. I want to go back to my homeland. And we sensitize them to the issues there. We make sure that they are properly informed about the situation there, and some of them go back. But we also have spontaneous repatriation, where people just go of their own volition. So voluntary repatriation is going on, but it's important, Lillian, that audiences understand that this is something that the Kenyan government want. This is something that the Kenyan government have decided on. And our role as UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, is to support refugees who are part of this voluntary repatriation program.
And we hope to be seeing more of you and hearing more of you as regards to what your agency is doing in terms of refugee aid, and indeed, just covering the stories around these camps. Because I had a conversation with you and you told me that there's a lot that's going on in there. There's a lot of stories that need to be shared, and therefore we hope to actually partner and be able to bring these stories out more openly. I know there's not been a lot of coverage around there, and we certainly hope that your presence within the agency will change that.
Absolutely, and I must get this in. You're absolutely right. Briefly, traditionally what we have done is spoon-fed refugees. Give them shelter, give them food, give them water. Okay, the basic necessities to survive. But there's been a change of approach and a change of attitude institutionally, from a humanitarian-based attitude to a development-based attitude. So what we are now saying is, look, if somebody comes from South Sudan or Somalia, and we know that the average lifespan of a refugee being in Kenya is 15 or 17 years, why keep them in a camp? What sense does it make? Can they contribute to our society, Kenyan society? Can they contribute to Kenya's economy? And studies have shown, several I could point to, but there's one particular one by the World Bank, that actually when you empower refugees, when you enable them to continue their education or to continue working or to continue in the line of business that they were in prior to them becoming refugees, you actually empower them economically, so they're less of a burden on the nation that is hosting them, in this case Kenya, on humanitarian organizations like UNHCR, and they're actually more likely to go home. So what we are promoting and trying to get the public almost to understand is that refugees ought to be included, they ought to be integrated. When you go to Garissa, I told you, when you go to Garissa and Kakuma, you'll be shocked, because in most people's minds, when they think of refugees, they think of a camp, a tented area with people living inside it. It's the complete opposite in many cases. There's economy, there's social and economic integration with Kenyans in Garissa, in Turkana. People are doing business, people are getting married, people are having children, people are getting divorced. I mean, you name it. It's all happening. And there needs to be a paradigm shift in the mentality, okay, and in the mindset of people, that actually any of us, you, me, this could happen to us. God forbid something were to happen in our country and we found ourselves in Congo, in Somalia, in DRC. Why should we be stopped from pursuing our professional goals, from pursuing our education? When you empower refugees, it's actually of benefit to the whole society.
And that is why she is the UNHCR spokesperson. She's very well spoken. Thank you so much, Yvonne. This is Yvonne Ndege. She's not a stranger to your screens, I'm sure. For those of you who've watched Al Jazeera over the years, BBC, you're familiar with this face. Very quickly as we close, Lillian, please ask Yvonne, I'm a refugee from Congo in Kenya more than 4 years, but not yet, I don't have a mandate. Every time the UN gives me a renewable appointment, how can you help me, please? I don't quite understand this question, but indeed a lot of questions. Yeah, you understand.
I do understand her question. One of the challenges is resources. You know, one of the big issues is this. We have 65 million refugees, roughly globally. 20 million are in Africa, on the continent of Africa. Almost 3 million are in this region. But when you look at the funding, okay, I'm talking about the cash needed to provide basic services, it's only 14% funded. So it means we are unable to actually deliver our mandate as effectively as we would want, to provide the kind of services to the lady who has sent in a question tonight. It could be that she hasn't been registered properly. It could be that her file is behind, a million other files. Do you understand what I'm saying? And all of this is down to resourcing. And that brings me to, a recent campaign that we launched called Luku Luku, which is all about sensitizing and informing the public about the fact that this problem is not the West's problem, it's not Europe's problem, it's our problem. And we need to take ownership of our problem in keeping with our traditions and our values as Africans, and say, okay, well, if 3 million people, or whatever it may be, have crossed into Kenya or this region from South Sudan, we need to be the solution. Let's look for the solutions here. What can the average person do? You and I, what can we contribute to make a difference, make a change? This lady who has contacted you tonight, or gentleman,
they don't leave their name.
We don't know. This person, this is a question of resourcing. So we do need more resources. Traditionally, as you probably know, the West has funded or financed the refugee problem in Africa. It's time for us to take action and responsibility.
Thank you so much. Your message is now we're closing. Hi, Yvonne. Thank you so much for speaking to us. You are bold, confident, and intelligent. Awesome. Yvonne Ndege, you're a powerhouse. You're a great woman. Somebody's saying, I love you. Kudos, girl. Can the Kenyan women take cue? This is actually Honorable Jane Kihara, the Member of Parliament, Naivasha. Thank you very much for that. Somebody here is saying, thank you so much, Yvonne, for sharing your story. You don't know how much you've inspired journalism students across the country. There's not a lot of opportunities to get into media houses here, but thank you for encouraging us. So a lot of messages coming in. Thanking you so much for your time in studio this evening, Yvonne. Like I said, we hope to see more of you.
Lillian, thank you.
You're welcome. And that's all the time we had on Citizen Weekend. Thank you so much for watching. Keep it Citizen TV. Good night.